You have exactly 3 seconds to like and subscribe to the channel. Otherwise, I'll appear in your dreams tonight. To ask for a donation for that cup of coffee, link below.
Welcome to TT Military. Half a century ago, a bloody border conflict erupted between two neighboring socialist countries, the Soviet Union and China, over a disputed sandbar on a river that stretched between them, bringing the two nations to the brink of an all-out nuclear war. In this conflict, both sides deployed regimental-level forces, supported by tanks and heavy artillery, fiercely battling for the small island of 0.74 squared, resulting in hundreds of deaths. The truth about the 1969 clash on Zumbao Island and the Sino-Soviet nuclear crisis will be revealed in today's video. Hot. A bloody conflict broke out on the small island that China called Zumbao and the Soviet Union called Damansky, on the Ussuri River, the border river dividing the two countries. Due to a dispute over ownership of the island, according to the Sino-Russian Treaty signed in Beijing in 1860 between the Russian Tsar and the Qing dynasty, the eastern border between the two countries was marked by the Ussuri River. The issue of ownership of Tranbao Island, located on the river, remained undetermined for almost the entire 20th century. Both China and the Soviet Union claimed sovereignty over this island, which covers an area of 74 square kilometers and is mostly located in the west. The Chinese side argues that, according to the treaty, the border lies in the middle of the river, and since this island is located mainly to the west, it should belong to China. After the People's Republic of China was established on October 1, the two sides initially maintained close relations. So the border issue was set aside. By the late 9th, Sino-Soviet relations had gradually deteriorated due to ideological disputes and disagreements over policies and strategies. In 1959, when the Sino-Indian border conflict occurred, the Soviet Union sided with India, withdrawing experts, cutting aid, and ending all cooperation projects. Soon, Sino-Soviet relations reached a deadlock, and the border issue, which had been set aside for many years, was brought up again with fierce debates. Sporadic, violent clashes have occurred along the border between the two countries' patrol forces, especially on the islands of Tranbao and Viet Nam on the Ussuri River. It started with verbal arguments, then escalated to physical altercations, and finally to the use of sticks, knives. Both sides accuse each other of being responsible for the tense situation on the border between the two countries. The Chinese side alleges that, from October 9, 1969, the Soviet Union caused 419 incidents on the border. Most serious. 19 Soviet border guards used armored vehicles to land on Kilikin Island, killing 4 Chinese civilians. The Soviet side also accused China of proactively instigating provocative incidents on the border. From the end of March 1960, the number of incidents of Chinese soldiers crossing into Soviet territory increased steadily. From October 1960, there were 36 incidents involving 150 Chinese soldiers crossing the border and engaging in aggression. In the first half of April 1965, there were 12 more incidents involving over 500 Chinese soldiers and civilians. Notably, on 200 Chinese nationals with 8 tractors, supported by soldiers, crossed into Soviet territory to cultivate land. Upon encountering a Soviet border patrol, they engaged in violent and insulting behavior. By 1967, the number of incursions and provocations had suddenly increased to over 2,000, accompanied by a wave of anti-Soviet propaganda in this populous country. They always propagated the idea that it was entirely caused by the Soviet side, and that they were forced to retaliate in self-defense. The vast majority of Chinese people and the international community accept that explanation because, before the Soviet Union, China was the weaker party. However, through documents, recently declassified by both sides and memoirs from contemporaries and witnesses, the historical truth turns out to be quite different. That is, this conflict, or more accurately, the war over Zhengbao Island, was initiated and carried out by China, due to the significant disparity in weaponry and training between China and the Soviet Union at that time. China could only resort to a surprise attack strategy, suddenly launching surprise assaults and concentrating superior military forces to deliver a preemptive strike to annihilate the enemy. In 1969, after being approved by Mao Zedong, the commander of the Shenyang military region planned the counterattack on Zhengbao Island in March 1969. On the night of March 1st of that year, Chinese soldiers, braving the freezing temperatures of 30 degrees Celsius, secretly ambushed the island. The following morning, a bait squad led by Border Guard Station Chief Tan Ngoc went aboard the island for patrol. The Soviet side immediately sent troops to the island to drive them out. Over 70 Soviet soldiers were trapped on the island and lured into an ambush by Chinese troops. Caught by surprise, the Soviet side launched a counterattack but were caught off guard and suffered heavy losses. After more than an hour of fierce fighting, the Soviet contingent was almost completely wiped out. 38 killed, were 2 military vehicles destroyed, and 1 damaged. On the Chinese side, there were 17 casualties. After several days of calm, on March 15th, the armies of both sides resumed fierce clashes. The Soviet side used tanks, armored vehicles, aircraft, and their then secret weapon, the BM-21 Grad multiple rocket launcher. Meanwhile, China uses anti-tank guns, DKs, B-4, and ground artillery positioned deep within Chinese territory. Soviet soldiers recounted 18 combat vehicles launched 720 rockets, each weighing 100 kg. In just 1 minute, all 720 rockets flew deep into Chinese territory, causing heavy damage to the forward command post. The Chinese soldiers then withdrew from the island, probably not expecting such a strong response from us. The attack resulted in heavy losses to the entire Chinese reserve force. Depots, military equipment, ammunition supply stations, and frontline infrastructure, along with their troops, according to figures released by China. The Soviet Union suffered over 60 dead, over 80 wounded, and 14 military vehicles destroyed. They suffered the loss of 12 soldiers and 27 wounded. But the actual number was probably much higher. Notably, 1T, considered the most modern of the Soviet Union at the time, was damaged by gunfire and left behind on the island from March 17th to April 1st. A fierce battle took place between the two sides to capture and hold this, resulting in several more deaths. The Soviet Union, not wanting the military secrets of this modern tank to fall into Chinese hands, sent an explosives team to destroy it. But they were repelled by the Chinese. Finally, the Soviet Union used artillery fire to pierce the ice, causing the T-62 to sink to the bottom of the river. Under cover of darkness, the Chinese side secretly deployed naval divers to the river to attach cables and successfully salvage the tank. They towed it to the 649 Tank Overall factory in Foshan for repairs, then transported it to Shenyang. It was moved to Beijing and displayed in the Chinese Military Museum. Based on this tank prototype, replicated and manufactured its own version of the main battle tank. During the battle for China suffered an additional 42 casualties from Soviet artillery fire. At the end of the conflict, which was essentially a real war, with both sides using regular troops and modern weapons and equipment, China said they killed and wounded 230 Soviet soldiers. The Soviet Union reported 152 casualties and destroyed 19 tanks and armored vehicles. China only acknowledged 92 casualties, while the Soviet Union claimed that the PLA suffered nearly 1, including 600 Chinese deaths on March 15 alone. Subsequent, both sides amassed large numbers of troops near the riverbank, with China gaining de facto control of the island. But it was also from this point that the two sides were drawn to the brink of nuclear war. In this brief conflict at Zhengbao Island, the Soviet army suffered its heaviest losses since World War II. The Soviet leadership was astonished and reacted strongly, because China had not responded to the request to sit down for negotiations for a long time. The Soviet Union, on the one hand, propagated in the press that they were preparing a nuclear attack on Chinese nuclear facilities. On the other hand, they were frantically preparing to carry out military revenge, according to Chinese accusations. The Soviet Union used hundreds of troops, supported by tanks and armored vehicles, to cross the border and ambush Chinese border guards in the Yumen area of Xinjiang, completely wiping out a Chinese patrol team of 38 people. Those advocating a hardline stance against China within the Soviet military proactively deployed medium-range missiles carrying nuclear warheads in the Far East, targeting strategically important military and political objectives in China, threatening a surgical nuclear strike. At this time, taking advantage of the US maintaining a neutral stance, the Soviet Union informed the US of its intention to launch a nuclear attack on China. However, driven by global interests, the US declared it could not stand idly by. The US deliberately issued a coded order stating that, if a Sino-Soviet nuclear war were to occur, it would immediately launch nuclear attacks on more than 130 strategic targets in the Soviet Union. Only then did the Chinese leadership realize the seriousness of the problem, hastily adopted war preparations as a new strategic arrangement. Key Chinese leaders were, and important documents were moved and hidden in the southwestern region. The Army and Fort. The Air Force evacuated more than 4, and the Navy evacuated more than 6 warships. Hundreds of millions of people and cities were drawn into a state of war preparedness. Major cities urgently organized air defense drills. Underground shelters and fortifications were built everywhere. The national economy has shifted to a wartime state. Many factories, enterprises switched to producing weapons and defense equipment and had to evacuate to mountainous areas. The Soviet Union deployed millions of troops near the Chinese border and sent 200,000 troops to be stationed in Mongolia. Hundreds of bombers capable of carrying nuclear bombs have been deployed to the Far East region. In the early 90s, the whole of China lived in an atmosphere of pre-war tension. Of all the wars China has fought with foreign powers since 1949, the Sino-Soviet conflict over Jumba Island, though the smallest in scale, nearly pushed the world to the brink of nuke, its impact and consequences far exceeding those of previous incidents. The fact that China and the Soviet Union drew their swords and were ready to fire their arrows finally made Mao Zedong realize that China could not simultaneously confront and wage war against both superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Therefore, he quickly seized the olive branch offered by Washington. Relations between China and the United States are beginning to ease. It could be said that Nixon's visit to Beijing began amidst the smoke of gunfire on Jumba Island. The rapprochement between China and the United States has broken the bipolar world order dominated by the US and the Soviet Union. In 1991, Russia recognized Jumba Island as belonging to China. In 2004, China and Russia signed the Black Hat Island Agreement, a Bolshoi-Ussuriysky Island, also known as the Supplementary Treaty on the eastern section of the Sino-Russian border, in which Russia returned to China the entire Silver Dragon Island Tarabarov, part of Black Hat Island, and Abahitu Shoal on the Argon, which they were occupying. The transfer of the islands was completed on June 2, 2005. At the 300 km long Sino-Russian border has been defined. Currently, Jumba Island, along with the nearby islands of Kuliksin and Kabozi, all belong to China. What are your thoughts on the historical conflict between the Soviet Union and China over this island? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. And now, goodbye and see you again.